Big a backup disk do I need? Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Here's a comment I got the other day. My main reason for my comment is to find out what size of a storage device is required to save the backup of my hard drives. At least as large as all drives combined, 2 or 3 times the size of all drives. I have not been backing up my CPUs. I have 2 desktops and a laptop, all with several terabyte hard drives. It sounds overwhelming to back up everything, but I know I need to do so. Any suggestions for me to get started? You know, it's a common question. There are several things to take into consideration, including how much data you have to back up, how many backups you're going to keep, how long you're going to keep them, and how else you might use that external backup drive. And of course, we can't forget price. It's also something that tends to change over time for a variety of reasons. What I want to do in this video is walk through the things you need to consider, and then I'll share my rule of thumb that should at least get you started, even if some of the other stuff doesn't quite make sense. All right, first we need to talk about size. In your question, you mentioned the size of your drives. That's a good measure, but it's often overkill. To be fair, we rarely fill up our hard disks to capacity. More often, we end up upgrading them to larger drives or changing what we store on them. There's a different number I'd have you consider instead: the space used on each drive so far. For example, here's the C drive on my main machine. It's a 1 terabyte drive, which as you can tell shows up as 931 gigabytes. But I'm only using less than that. I'm using less than half of that actually. You can see it's got 493 gigabytes free. So that's the number that matters. The difference is the number that matters. I'm only using a little less than 438 gigabytes. That's the number that matters. The unused space does not need to be backed up. If you're going to rely on any single number, consider the amount of data currently stored on your hard drives. Different backup programs use different techniques to store and, most importantly, compress the images that they take. For example, Macrium Reflect creates an image file that takes up less space than the original data. Now, the size of the image file is interesting, but again, not the primary number I'd have you pay attention to. Just be aware that when you look at the amount of data you have, chances are a single image is actually going to take up a little less space. If you take incremental backups instead of only full, your backups are going to take even less space. Now, when I took a full backup, you can see that it took 427 gigabytes or thereabouts. However, the very next incremental backup was only 4 gigabytes. It's dramatically smaller. Why? Because it contains only those things that changed on that day. The reason I mention this is because with a monthly full image and then daily incremental backups kind of schedule, a month's worth of daily backups could take up less than 600 gigabytes in space, as opposed to a month's worth of daily full backups, which would probably be something closer to 1.5 terabytes. Okay, how long do you expect to keep your backups? The general rule, of course, is until you're sure you won't need them. But that's really ambiguous, and we're never really sure. It's not a helpful rule. My approach has been to keep 3 months of daily backups, in other words, both full and incremental, as I just described. I discard the incremental backups older than that, so I have another 3 months worth of monthly snapshots. And then I might eventually cherry pick some of those to save, perhaps the quarterlies or just the one I take on the first of the year, and then discard everything else. Now, I'll be 100% honest. I'm an anomaly. I'm not normal when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I can tell you that I've rarely needed a backup older than just a few days or weeks. So, unless you have other requirements, I would advise you to keep at least a month's worth of daily backups. Ideally, 2 or 3 months, but let your backup program manage the space for you. Now, something else to consider is if your backup drive, your external drive, is going to be dedicated to only backups, or will it also serve some other purposes? Now, those other purposes could, for example, include backups of a different form, like Windows file history, or it could be manual archives of your own, or it could be something else entirely. My preference is that a backup drive be dedicated solely to backups. Got to talk about price. Large drives cost more than small drives, generally. While prices have steadily declined over the years, honestly, our appetite for data usage is keeping pace. Larger is generally better since it gives you more breathing room, but it comes at a literal cost. And while I strongly believe that backing up is worth it, I also understand that that's not practical for everyone. All right, with all of those factors in mind, what are we going to do? My general rule of thumb is this: get a drive that is at least 4 times as big as the amount of data that you intend to back up. Remember, just a rule of thumb. Depending on your situation, you may want or need to do something different, but it's at least a starting point if you're not sure. Again, note that I'm referring to the amount of data, not the size of your drives. If you're backing up multiple drives, add up all the amount of data used on them for this calculation. With all the competing aspects of the size of the backups you might accumulate over time, I think that this actually represents a pretty reasonable compromise. Of course, there's always nothing wrong with going even larger if your budget allows for it. Bottom line, backup, and I gotta say I am absolutely thrilled that you're working on doing exactly that. As I often say, that puts you way ahead of so many people that I hear from. Hopefully, though, the discussion we've just had will give you some ideas on exactly how large a drive to get. Remember, there's really nothing wrong with too large if you're on the fence. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, visit askleo.com/181334. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.